The night he showed up at the hotel, Rin was carrying a tray of champagne flutes toward the penthouse elevator, quietly calculating whether she had enough in her account to cover both rent and her sister's birthday dinner. That was the kind of thing a person thought about while working the evening concierge shift at the Ashford. She was surrounded by wealth so extreme it stopped feeling real, while somewhere in the back of her mind, she was working out whether she could afford the bus or would need to walk home again. Rin had worked at the Ashford for 11 months, long enough to know which guests tipped and which didn't, long enough to know that the man in Suite 1401, the one who had booked the entire 14th floor for the week, whose reservation carried 3 asterisks in the hotel system meaning management handled everything personally, was not someone she was supposed to have any direct contact with. His name was listed simply as Mr. Harlow. That was all she knew. That, and the fact that he had standing orders for a specific brand of scotch, that his meals were delivered by the head chef personally, and that 2 men, who looked like they had been carved out of granite, stood outside his door at all times. She hadn't spoken to him. She had barely even seen him. Once, coming out of the service elevator, she had caught a glimpse of him at the end of the corridor. Tall, dark coat, the kind of stillness that made a room feel smaller. He had glanced in her direction for exactly 1 second before turning away. That was the extent of it. To understand what happened next, one first had to understand Derek. Ren and Derek had been together for almost 3 years. She had ended it 8 months before any of this happened, and for a while, she thought it was over the way these things were supposed to be over. Quietly, with some sadness, and then eventually not. Derek had seemed completely reasonable in the beginning. He was funny. He remembered small details. He showed up with the exact coffee order she had mentioned once in passing. And for a while she thought, this is what it feels like to be known. What she didn't understand until much later was that the remembering wasn't tenderness. It was inventory. By the end of their 2nd year together, she couldn't make a decision without explaining it. She couldn't have dinner with a friend without him calling twice before she got home. When she finally said the thing she had been rehearsing for months, "I need to end this," he sat very still for a long time, and then said, "You'll change your mind." He said it like a fact, not a threat. A fact. For 6 months afterward, Ren had a new phone number, a new address, and the kind of hypervigilance that was difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't lived it. She was always scanning. She learned which exits were fastest. She noticed when someone had been parked on her street for too long. She thought she had been careful enough. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of evening where the light drained out of the sky early, and the wind off the lake had real teeth. Ren was covering the front desk, while a colleague was on break. The lobby of the Ashford was all dark marble and warm lighting, the kind of place that made everyone who walked through the door feel like they had just arrived somewhere important. She saw Derek before he saw her. He was coming through the revolving door, wearing a particular expression he always had when he'd made a decision. Calm, almost pleasant, like he had already run through every possible outcome and settled on the one he wanted. Her body understood what was happening before her brain caught up. She felt her hands go cold. She set down the pen she was holding very carefully, afraid of dropping it and making a sound. He saw her the moment she hoped he wouldn't. The smile that crossed his face was the thing she had been afraid of for 8 months. It was the smile of someone who had been looking for something and found it. "There you are," he said, just like she was a set of keys he'd misplaced. Ren stepped back from the desk. "You need to leave. I just want to talk." He was already moving around the side of the counter, the way he always moved through space, like he was entitled to it. "You haven't returned any of my messages, because I don't want contact with you. That's clear. I've made that clear." "You've been dramatic," he said. And there it was, the old reframe, the thing he did where her reality became a performance she was putting on. "I'm going to call security," Ren said. He laughed, soft and almost fond. "Come on." He reached for her arm, his hand closing around her wrist. She heard herself make a sound she didn't intend to, something between a breath and the beginning of a word. In that same moment, she became aware that the lobby had gone very quiet. Not empty. Quiet. The elevator doors at the far end of the lobby opened. Mr. Harlow walked out. He wasn't rushing. He was walking the way he always seemed to move, unhurried, with the specific gravity of someone who has never once needed to announce himself. One of the granite men was at his left. Another Wren hadn't seen before was already crossing the lobby floor. Derek's hand was still on her wrist. Mr. Harlow looked at Derek's hand. Then he looked at Derek's face. Just for a moment so brief that if Wren hadn't been watching closely, she would have missed it. Then he looked at her. She didn't know what he saw. Whatever it was, something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone would catch on camera, but it shifted. He said something to the man beside him, low, barely audible. The man nodded once. Derek became aware of them approximately 2 seconds later. The change in him was immediate. The pleasant expression didn't disappear exactly. It recalibrated. He released her wrist. "I think," Mr. Harlow said from somewhere around 10 feet away, not raising his voice at all, "that the lady asked you to leave." He hadn't spoken to Run. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Derek with the particular attention of someone who was deciding something. Derek opened his mouth, closed it. "There's a car outside," Mr. Harlow continued, still calm, still unhurried. "I'd use it." Wren didn't know exactly how Derek left. She only knew that he did. She was looking at the marble floor, trying to breathe in a way that looked like regular breathing, gripping the edge of the counter with both hands. When she looked up, the lobby was normal again. Guests. A pianist starting the evening set in the bar to the left. Mr. Harlow was still there. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not pity. Not the uncomfortable distance people put between themselves and a scene they've just witnessed. Something more direct than either of those things. "Are you all right?" he asked. She almost said yes automatically, the way people do. Then she didn't. "I'll be fine," she said instead. "I'm sorry you had to." "Don't apologize," he said, and something in the way he said it made her stop. He left after that, back to the elevator, back to the 14th floor, back to whatever world existed up there that had nothing to do with hers. Wren stood at the front desk for another 4 hours and did her job perfectly and thought about almost nothing else. She expected that to be it. He was a guest. She was staff. It had been an extraordinary moment, and she assumed it would recede into background noise the way extraordinary moments do, when the people involved have no reason to speak again. She had no idea how wrong she was. The next morning, there was a note waiting at the concierge desk, folded neatly. Her name, just Run, her first name, which she had given him when he asked if she was all right, written on the outside in handwriting that was economical and precise. "If you need anything handled regarding last night's visitor, I can arrange it. H." She stood there holding it for a while. Handled was a word that could mean a lot of things. She wrote back on hotel stationery, folded it, and asked the morning supervisor to see that it reached Suite 1401. "Thank you. I filed a report with security. I think it's taken care of." His response came back within the hour. "Good, but let me know if it isn't." She put that note in her jacket pocket and kept it there without thinking too hard about why. Over the following week, something shifted in the way Mr. Harlow occupied the hotel. Not dramatically. He didn't seek her out. He didn't appear at her desk or manufacture reasons to walk through the lobby. But Wren became aware of a kind of attention that she didn't have language for at the time. Small things. The route his security detail took through the lobby in the evenings seemed to thread past the front desk more consistently than before. Once, when a guest became agitated over a reservation issue, raising his voice, leaning over the counter in that particular way some men do when they've decided that louder is persuasive, she saw one of the granite men appear at the edge of the lobby within 30 seconds. He didn't intervene. He just stood there, visible, and the guest's voice came down by half. After the guest left, the man returned to wherever he'd come from. They didn't acknowledge each other. Wren told herself she was imagining a pattern. She was not imagining a pattern. On her Friday evening shift, there was a delay with the 14th floor meal delivery, and the head chef asked her to run it up. "Just this once," he said. The usual staff were tied up with a private event. "Yes," she said, "because that's what you say." She knocked. The door was opened by one of the men she recognized. "Concierge delivery," she said. He stepped back and gestured her in. The suite was the kind of space that made a person recalibrate their sense of scale. Floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out below with the lake, beyond it going dark under an overcast sky. The lamps were on, Papers spread across a long table, not left carelessly, but arranged with a specific order. The kind of organized that meant someone was in the middle of actual work. Mr. Harlow was standing at the window. He turned when she came in. He was wearing a gray sweater rather than a jacket for the first time, which made him look not different exactly, but like a different layer of the same person. "Thank you," he said. "Of course." She set the tray on the designated table and turned to go. "Ren." She stopped. He wasn't looking at the tray or the window anymore. He was looking at her with that same direct, undecorated attention. "The man from the lobby," he said. "He's been outside the hotel twice this week." She felt the floor do something underneath her, metaphorically. "How do you?" "My people pay attention," he said simply. She stood there beside the window. The city lights were beginning to come up against the dark. She thought about Derek's face when he'd said, "There you are." The particular ownership in it. "He's not going to stop," she said, not to Mr. Harlow specifically. More to herself, out loud, for the first time. "No," he said. "He isn't." Something about the absence of false reassurance was unexpectedly steadying. "There are things that can be done," he said, "if you want." She should have been more unsettled by the open-endedness of that sentence. Coming from anyone else, she would have been. Coming from him, from someone who had watched Derek walk out of that lobby with the specific, practiced efficiency of a man who understood consequences, it landed differently. "I'm not asking you to do anything illegal," she said. "I'm not suggesting anything illegal," he said, and there was something in it that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. "I have lawyers. A restraining order has more teeth when the person filing it has support." She hadn't thought about it that way, that a piece of paper could mean something different depending on who was standing behind it. They talked for 40 minutes that evening, longer than she should have stayed, longer than made any professional sense. He asked about the timeline, when Derek had started showing up, how he'd found the hotel, whether she'd documented anything. He listened in the way that some people are constitutionally incapable of, completely, without preparing his next sentence. When she finally said she needed to get back, he nodded. "The offer stands," he said. "Whatever form is useful." She said goodnight. In the elevator going down, she realized her hands had unclenched for the first time, and she couldn't remember how long they had been clenched. The next 2 weeks moved in a way Ren hadn't expected. A lawyer called her. She said she was representing Mr. Harlow's interests in a professional capacity, and that she'd been asked to assist Ren with the civil matter if she consented to it. The lawyer was crisp and precise, and had clearly done this kind of thing before. Within 4 days, Ren had a restraining order filed, documented, and served, with the lawyer's office listed as the contact address rather than her home address, meaning Derek couldn't use the legal paperwork the way restraining orders can sometimes be misused, as a map to where someone lives. She didn't see Mr. Harlow during those 2 weeks, except in passing. A nod in the lobby once, his detail moving through as she was finishing a shift, and him pausing just briefly enough to ask, "Is it proceeding?" "Yes," she said. "Good." He kept walking. She told herself that was the appropriate shape of things. He was a guest. He'd been decent. It was over now. Then, on a Tuesday evening, the kind of evening where the sleet comes sideways off the lake and everyone in the city is privately agreeing they should have moved somewhere warmer, Ren was finishing her closing checklist when she heard her name. He was standing near the bar entrance, alone for once, at least no visible detail, though she'd learned by then that alone was a relative term with him. "I'm leaving on Thursday," he said. Something moved in her chest that she didn't examine too closely. "I hope the stay was satisfactory," she said, in her concierge voice. The corner of his mouth did something. It was. He looked at her for a moment. She wanted to say, "You handled everything with more composure than most people would have." "I didn't feel composed," she said instead. "That's usually what composure actually is," he said. She thought about that for a second. "Thank you for everything. The lawyer, all of it." He waved it off in a way that managed not to be dismissive. More like the accounting of it was unnecessary. "I'll be back in the city in March," he said, "if you're still here." It was phrased so carefully. Not a proposition, not a promise. Just an opening left open, with nothing required of her. "I expect I will be," she said. He nodded once, Like that settled something. "Good night, Wren," he said. "Good night." And then he was gone, and the lobby was just a lobby again, and the sleet was still coming sideways off the lake, and Wren stood there for a moment before finishing her checklist. March came the way Canadian springs do, reluctantly, the cold hanging on past its welcome, the city still gray and gritty while everyone insisted there was warmth coming. He arrived on a Wednesday. Wren was at the desk. When the reservation had come up in the system the previous week, she'd been aware of a feeling she couldn't quite categorize and didn't try to. She just noted the date and kept working. When he walked through the lobby Wednesday afternoon, he looked the same. The dark coat, the unhurried movement, the quality of attention he brought to whatever was in front of him. He glanced at the desk and found her there, and something in the deliberateness of that glance told her he'd expected to. "Mr. Ashford," he said, which was the hotel's name, not hers, and somehow contained a quiet joke. "Mr. Harlow," she said. "Welcome back." He checked in. He went upstairs. That evening, a note arrived at the desk. "Dinner tomorrow, if you're free. Not as hotel staff. As yourself. H." She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the 8 months of scanning rooms for exits. She thought about what it had taken to trust her own assessment of a room again, of a person, after Derek had spent 3 years teaching her that her assessments were wrong. She thought about the elevator going down from the 14th floor and her hands unclenching. Then she wrote back, "I'm free at 7. His name was Harlow in the hotel system, but the name he gave her over dinner, in a quiet restaurant in Yorkville where the staff clearly knew him and left them alone, was something else entirely. Something she would remember for a long time afterward. She was nervous at that dinner. Genuinely nervous in the way a person is when something feels real rather than managed. Inside the controlled environment of the hotel, he was a figure of significant intimidation. Out of it, in a restaurant, wearing a gray sweater again, ordering the kind of meal that suggested he actually thought about food rather than just consuming it. He was still that, but also someone who asked follow-up questions and remembered the answers, and sometimes went quiet for a moment before speaking, like the words mattered. They talked about the city, about the particular way Toronto winters made people unexpectedly honest with each other, like the cold stripped away certain performances. He told her about a city on the east coast of Scotland he had spent 3 years in during his 20s and still thought about when it rained. She told him about growing up 3 hours north of the city, about the specific silence of rural Ontario winters, about the way she had come to Toronto at 22 thinking she was going to make a specific kind of life, and had made a completely different one instead, and hadn't decided yet whether to be disappointed about it. He listened. He actually listened. At one point he said, "You could have left hospitality. You're clearly capable of other things." "I'm good at it," she said. "I'm excellent at it." She corrected herself. "That's not the same question," he said. She didn't have an answer to that. Or rather, she had an answer she hadn't articulated to anyone yet, including herself, that she had stayed because the hotel felt like a place where she had control, where she knew the variables. After Derek, controllable environments had become the thing she sought without naming. She didn't say all of that at dinner, but she said some of it. Enough. When they walked out, it was properly cold. The first clear night in a week, the city sharp-edged under a sky that had given up being overcast. He had a car waiting. He asked if she needed a ride. "I take the subway," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking if you'd like not to tonight." She thought about the specific stubbornness that had gotten her through the past 8 months, the way she had refused to reroute her whole life around what Derek had done. Then she thought, this is different. This is a choice made toward something, not away from something. "All right," she said. In the car, quietly expensive, with a driver who was clearly also the kind of person who appeared in lobbies when voices were raised, he didn't try to fill the silence. They watched the city go by. The lake appeared briefly between buildings, flat and very black under the clear sky. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. That night in the lobby. You weren't there by accident. You'd have seen it on the cameras." He was quiet for a moment. "My people monitor the lobby. Standard practice." "So you knew what was happening before you came down?" "Yes. You didn't send someone else." He turned to look at her in the low light of the car. His expression was, for once, uncomplicated. "No," he said. I didn't. She let that sit for a moment. Why? He looked back out the window. The lake was gone now. Streets again. Because some things you don't send someone else to do, he said. It wasn't a complete answer. It wasn't meant to be. But it was honest. And after years of a relationship, where her sense of what was honest had been systematically dismantled, honest landed like something solid underfoot. The weeks that followed were careful. That was the word she kept coming back to. Careful. But not in the way of people who are afraid. In the way of people who understand that something fragile can also be real, and treat it accordingly. He traveled. He was often unreachable, in ways he was straightforward about. I'll be out of contact for 4 days. I'll call when I'm back. And he always did. He didn't ask questions he didn't have the right to ask yet. He didn't push at the edges of what she'd offered. For the first time in a long time, she was trusted to know her own pace. Her colleague at the desk, a woman named Harriet, who had worked the hotel for 7 years and had seen everything, asked her one afternoon in March if she was seeing someone. She thought about how to answer that. I think so, she said. I'm still figuring out what that means. Harriet nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable thing to say and went back to her reservation screen. Rin thought, for the first time in a long time, that she was figuring things out on her own terms, in her own time, without someone standing at her shoulder deciding what the terms were. Derek violated the restraining order in late February, before the dinner, before March had even arrived. Rin should have mentioned it sooner, but the memory still carried a strange weight, even now. He had been photographed outside the hotel by the security team, not lurking dramatically, not doing anything a passerby would have noticed, just standing across the street for 11 minutes, according to the timestamp on the footage, watching the entrance the way he used to watch her apartment building in the early days after she left him. The lawyer had it dealt with swiftly, and with very little drama on Ren's end. That detail mattered to her more than she expected it to. For 8 months, every previous interaction with the legal system had required her to justify herself, to explain again and again why she was afraid, to provide evidence that her fear was reasonable rather than dramatic. A word Derek had used against her so many times that she'd started to believe it herself. This was different. The security team had documented the violation without asking her to prove anything. The lawyer had filed the necessary paperwork without asking her to relive the details one more time for someone new. Derek was charged. The case moved forward. Rin was kept informed, but she was not required to manage it, chase it, or carry it entirely on her own shoulders, the way she had carried everything else related to him for the past year. It was the first time since she had ended things with Derek that someone had taken the document seriously, taken the threat seriously, without asking her to justify why she was afraid in the first place. Rin thought about that a great deal in the weeks that followed. She thought about all the ways fear gets treated differently, depending on who is standing behind you when you report it. She had filed the first restraining order alone, driven herself to the police station alone, sat across from an officer who took notes, without much urgency alone. She remembered the particular exhaustion of having to perform her own fear convincingly enough that someone else would act on it. This time, there had been no performance required. Someone had looked at the situation and said, without hedging, yes, this is real, and yes, it matters, and yes, something can be done. After months of restraining orders that felt like legal paperwork filed into a void, that was not a small thing. She knew, even as she felt the relief of it, that the particular shape of what had helped her wasn't available to everyone. She had thought about it a lot, what it meant that the protection she finally received came from proximity to a kind of power that most people couldn't access. It sat in her uncomfortably sometimes, the inequality of it. She knew women who had filed restraining orders that were never enforced. She knew women whose stalkers had never been photographed, never been charged, never been made to feel the weight of actual consequence. She didn't pretend that what had happened to her was fair in some broader sense, but she also knew what it felt like to finally be believed, and she couldn't make herself regret that, even while she understood its imbalance. Callum, as she had started to think of him privately, though she still called him Mr. Harlow in front of anyone else at the hotel, never made her feel indebted for any of it. He never brought it up as though it were a favor she owed something in return for. When she thanked him again, weeks later, over a quiet dinner, He had simply said, "You don't need to keep thanking me. It's done." "It doesn't feel done to me yet," she admitted. "Not fully." "That's fair," he said. "These things don't resolve on the timeline of paperwork." She appreciated that he didn't try to rush her past the lingering unease, the way people sometimes did when they wanted a problem to feel finished simply because the legal steps were finished. He seemed to understand, in a way few people had, that the fear didn't evaporate the moment the charges were filed. It lingered in smaller ways. The way she still checked the peephole twice before opening her apartment door. The way certain sounds still made her flinch, even months later, even with the restraining order enforced and Derek facing real legal consequences for the first time. Callum never treated that lingering fear as an inconvenience. He never suggested she should simply feel safe now that the paperwork existed. Instead, he asked practical questions. Did she want the security detail extended to her apartment building for a period of time? Did she want a different route home suggested, one the driver could use without it seeming unusual? Did she want, simply, someone to check in more regularly during a difficult week? She didn't take him up on most of it. She wanted, more than anything, to prove to herself that she could rebuild her own sense of safety without leaning entirely on someone else's resources to do it for her. But she appreciated, deeply, that the offer was always there without pressure attached to it. One evening in early April, Wren sat with Harriet during a slow shift, and Harriet asked her directly, in the blunt way she had after 7 years of watching guests come and go, "Does he know what he's doing? For you, I mean. Not the money part. The other part." Wren considered the question seriously. "I think he does," she said. "I think that's actually the thing that surprises me most about him." "Good," Harriet said. "That's rarer than people think." Wren thought about that conversation often in the weeks that followed. She thought about the difference between being rescued and being believed. Derek had spent 3 years teaching her that her instincts were unreliable, that her fear was performance, that her reality needed his approval before it counted as real. Callum had done something almost opposite, without ever making a show of it. He had simply looked at what was happening and confirmed, without hesitation, that it was exactly as serious as she believed it to be. That confirmation, she realized slowly, mattered more to her recovery than any single legal document ever could. It wasn't that the restraining order itself healed anything. It was that someone had finally stood beside her assessment of danger instead of questioning it. By early summer, the case against Derek had progressed to the point where Wren rarely thought about him during her waking hours anymore. The charges moved through the system steadily. She was informed of court dates, but rarely required to attend in person beyond what was legally necessary. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Derek existed mostly as a closed file rather than a living, breathing threat occupying space in her daily thoughts. She still didn't know, entirely, what to make of everything that had happened, how quickly her life had shifted from quiet survival mode into something that felt, cautiously, like it might actually be safe. But she was learning slowly to trust that shift instead of waiting anxiously for it to collapse. By early summer, Wren's life had settled into a rhythm she barely recognized as her own, in the best possible way. She still worked at the Ashford, still knew which guests tipped and which didn't, still calculated bus fare against rent some months out of old habit rather than necessity. But underneath the familiar routine, something fundamental had shifted. Callum asked her, one weekend in June, if she wanted to get away from the city for a few days. He had a cottage rented north of Kingston, on a lake considerably smaller and darker than the one that bordered Toronto, ringed with pines instead of condominium towers. "Just us," he said. "No detail visible, though I imagine one nearby regardless." She laughed at that, because by then she understood enough about his world to know that alone was always a relative term with him, and she had stopped minding it the way she once might have. The cottage was simple in a way that surprised her, wood-paneled and unassuming, nothing like the penthouse suite where she had first delivered a dinner tray months earlier. There was a dock extending out over water that turned gold in the late afternoon light, and somewhere in the trees a loon called occasionally. The specific sound of northern Ontario summers that never grew less striking no matter how many times she'd heard it growing up. They spent the first evening mostly in comfortable silence, the kind that had become familiar between them over the preceding months. Callum grilled something simple for dinner, refusing her offer to help in a way that made her suspect he rarely got the chance to cook for himself and wanted to enjoy it uninterrupted. They ate on the dock as the light shifted from white to gold to the deep orange that precedes an early summer dusk. It was there, sitting with their feet nearly touching the water, that he asked her the question she hadn't expected, though perhaps she should have. "What would you have done," he said, "if I hadn't come down from the 14th floor that night?" Ren thought about it honestly before answering. She owed him that much, an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. "Called security," she said. "Filed another report. Gone home. Changed my route for a week. And then," she paused, "and then waited for the next time." He was quiet for a moment. The water moved gently against the dock posts. Somewhere in the trees, the loon called again. "I'm glad I came down," he said finally. "So am I," Ren said. She had been afraid, for a long time after Derek, that what she had learned from that relationship was something permanent, that she had been altered in a way that meant certain kinds of closeness were no longer available to her, that the inventory taking, the reframing, the subtle erosion of her own sense of what was real had changed the architecture of how she trusted people entirely. She wasn't wrong exactly. It had changed things. But sitting on that dock with the lake going gold in the late afternoon light, she understood something she hadn't fully articulated to herself before. Change didn't mean closed. It simply meant different. It meant she trusted more carefully now, more deliberately. But it didn't mean she had lost the capacity to trust at all. "Can I ask you something else?" she said. "Always." "Why me? Out of everyone you could have." She stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence, without it sounding like she was fishing for reassurance she didn't actually need. Callum considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things, without rushing toward an easy answer. "Because you didn't ask me to fix anything," he said eventually. "You accepted help when it was offered, but you never once asked for it. There's a difference, and it's rarer than you'd think." "I didn't want to owe you something," she admitted. "You don't," he said simply. "You never did." She looked out at the water, watching the light continue its slow shift toward evening. "I keep waiting for this to feel complicated in a way it hasn't yet," she said. "Given everything, given who you are, what you do, the world you actually live in most of the time." "It might eventually," he said honestly. "I won't pretend my life is simple, or that it won't occasionally intersect with yours in ways that are difficult. But I'd rather be honest with you about that than pretend otherwise." She appreciated, more than she could easily articulate, that he didn't try to minimize the complexity of his own life to make himself seem safer or easier to love. Derek had spent 3 years performing simplicity, performing reasonableness, while slowly eroding everything underneath it. Callum did the opposite. He let her see the complicated parts clearly, without apology, and trusted her to decide for herself what she could hold. "I think I'd rather know," she said. "Even the difficult parts." "Good," he said, "because I don't think I could do this the other way, even if I wanted to." They sat there a while longer as the sky deepened toward dusk, the water going from gold to deep blue, the first stars beginning to show faintly overhead. Neither of them said much else. It didn't feel like it needed filling. Later, walking back up from the dock in the near dark, Ren found herself thinking about the specific stubbornness that had carried her through the worst of the previous year, the refusal to let Derek's actions dictate the entire shape of her life afterward. She had made small decisions, one after another, that had eventually led her here, to this dock, this conversation, this particular quiet contentment she hadn't expected to feel again after everything. The hotel job, the shift she'd been covering that particular Thursday in October, the moment she hadn't simply said, "I'm fine," automatically, but had told the truth instead. Every small decision along the way had been hers, made deliberately rather than out of fear or habit, and that felt like something worth keeping, something worth protecting carefully going forward. She thought, too, about what Harriet had said months earlier, when Ren had admitted she was still figuring out what her relationship with Callum actually meant. She was still figuring it out, if she was honest. But she was doing the figuring on her own terms now, in her own time, without anyone standing at her shoulder deciding what those terms should be. That she understood clearly now. Sitting beside Callum in the deepening dark with the lake quiet behind them, was the actual gift of everything that had happened since that October evening. Not merely safety, though safety mattered enormously, but the return of her own authority over her own life, her own instincts, her own sense of what was real and worth trusting. The light on the lake changed slowly that evening, gold fading to blue, blue deepening toward the particular black that only settles over water far from any city's glow. Rin didn't say anything else for a while. Neither did Callum. They sat there together, the two of them and the lake, the evening coming in from the east. And it was enough. It was more than enough. Later, back inside the cottage, Rin found herself thinking about the entire arc of the past year in a way she hadn't allowed herself to fully examine before. She thought about the version of herself who had stood frozen at the concierge desk that October evening, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to breathe in a way that looked like regular breathing. She thought about how distant that particular fear now felt, not gone entirely, but manageable in a way it hadn't been for a very long time. She thought, too, about the discomfort she still occasionally felt regarding how she'd gotten here. The particular shape of the help she'd received wasn't available to most women in her position. She knew that clearly, and she had turned it over in her mind many times since that first night, examining it from every angle she could manage. It would have been easy to simply feel grateful and stop there, to let the relief of her own safety overshadow the uncomfortable truth that so many others facing similar danger received none of the swift, decisive protection she had been given. She didn't stop there. She let the discomfort sit alongside the gratitude, refusing to smooth over the inequality just because it had worked out for her personally. It felt important somehow to hold both truths at once rather than choosing the more comfortable one and discarding the rest. One evening, back in the city, she raised the subject with Callum directly, over a quiet dinner at his apartment rather than a restaurant this time. "It bothers me sometimes," she admitted. "How much of what helped me came down to who you are, what resources you have access to. Most women dealing with someone like Derek don't get a lawyer within 4 days. They don't get charges filed and actually pursued. They get exactly what I had before you, paperwork filed into a void." Callum listened without interrupting, the way he always did, giving her the full space to finish the thought before responding. "You're right," he said finally. "It isn't fair. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't try to convince you the discomfort you're feeling is misplaced, because it isn't." "Then what do I do with that?" she asked. "Just carry the guilt alongside the relief?" "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe you use whatever position you end up in eventually, whatever resources or influence you accumulate over time, to make sure fewer people have to depend entirely on luck the way you did. I can't fix the whole system, Ren, but I can tell you that the discomfort you're feeling right now, the refusal to simply accept your own good fortune without examining it, that's exactly the kind of person who eventually does something meaningful with whatever power they end up holding." She sat with that for a long moment, appreciating that he hadn't tried to talk her out of the discomfort or minimize it into something more palatable. He had simply acknowledged it as real and let her decide what to do with it herself. In the months that followed, Rin began slowly to think about ways she might eventually use her own growing sense of security to help others facing what she once had. Nothing dramatic at first. She started volunteering occasionally with the local support organization for women navigating restraining orders and the particular exhausting bureaucracy that often surrounded them. She understood, better than most volunteers, exactly how demoralizing it felt to have your fear questioned at every turn, and she found she was good at sitting with women in that specific kind of distress, offering the steady belief she herself had once been so desperate to receive. She never told most of them the full story of how she'd found her own way out. It felt, somehow, too specific to her own circumstances to be useful as a template for anyone else. But she found that the things she could offer, unconditional belief in someone's own assessment of their danger, translated regardless of circumstance. That, she had learned firsthand, mattered more than almost anything else. Derek's case eventually concluded with a conviction, though by the time it did, Rin found she felt very little about it either way. It wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't indifference. It was simply the quiet, unremarkable feeling of a chapter finally closing that had already stopped occupying much daily space in her mind. She had built enough of a life beyond him that his legal fate felt almost beside the point. Her relationship with Callum continued to develop carefully, the word she still returned to most often when trying to describe it. Careful, but not fearful. Careful in the way that people who understand something fragile can also be genuinely real, and choose to protect it accordingly, rather than rushing past the vulnerability towards some artificial certainty. She never fully stopped being aware of the complexity of his world, the parts of his life that existed at a considerable distance from anything she'd ever known before meeting him. But she found, increasingly, that she didn't need every part of his life explained or justified to her. She trusted him with the parts he chose to share, and she trusted her own judgment enough now to know when something required more explanation and when it didn't. Sitting one evening on her own apartment balcony, long after that first October night at the Ashford, Ren found herself reflecting on something she hadn't expected to understand so clearly. She had spent months, maybe years, waiting for someone or something to arrive and rescue her from the particular fear Derek had built around her life. She had imagined rescue as a single dramatic moment, a door kicked open, a villain defeated, a clean and immediate return to safety. What had actually happened was something quieter and slower than that, though it had certainly begun with one dramatic moment in a hotel lobby. It hadn't been a rescue in the way she'd once imagined rescues worked. It had been, instead, a door, one opportunity, offered without pressure, that she had then walked through entirely on her own terms, making choice after choice after choice, each one hers alone, each one building toward the life she now quietly, carefully, gratefully occupied. It turned out that some things, when they happen to you, don't arrive as rescues. They arrive as doors,